Welcome to Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hi everybody, my name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and critic on film. Today I'm going to be talking to Glenn Kenny. He's a writer whose work has appeared in many publications, including the New York Times and RogerEbert.com. He has written a book about Robert De Niro and edited a collection of essays on Star Wars. He has also just recently published Made Men, the Story of Goodfellas. It's available from all good bookstores, so make sure you pick up a copy if you haven't already. Also, if you enjoy the podcast, please don't hesitate to like, subscribe, share the word generally. And you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. But before you do any of that, please listen to and enjoy the conversation.
I was invited in April to go to the Paris cinema to introduce Goodfellas and sign some copies of my book. And that was exciting. That was a great show. My friend David Schwartz, who's now the programmer there for that movie theater that was rescued from non-existence by Netflix and mostly shows Netflix movies, but they were showing Ramin Bahrani's White Tiger, and he had said one of the biggest influences on that film was Goodfellas. So he asked that they screen Goodfellas on the same day that they screened White Tiger along with Pushcart Man and Chop Shop. So we screened at noon that day. I introduced the film and signed some books and saw some people, including the filmmaker and one-time Scorsese video archivist Gina Telleroli and a student of mine. And it was very nicely spaced out. And then, it was thrilling to see the movie. I'd seen it so many times while researching my book, Made Men, the Story of Goodfellas, but I hadn't seen it on a proper cinema screen in quite some time. And I found myself unexpectedly moved by a lot of what I saw. And then seeing some friends and acquaintances was terrific. Signing some books was great. So that was my first time back in a movie theater. My first time paying to see a picture was in Burbank. And on a Saturday, my wife had been working in Los Angeles and then she moved up to Seattle for location stuff. So I had a day at Liberty and I went to the AMC 16 in Burbank. Pristine cinema experience, and I saw Godzilla versus Kong, which was really dumb, but it was pretty much as advertised. It was Godzilla versus Kong.
Did they fight?
They did fight, and there, the director says, "Well, my vision for Godzilla versus Kong is not going to be some, indefinite thing. There definitely has to be a winner. There's a winner, sort of, and then, they both walk off into the sunset." More or less together. But they do that thing. Remember when Sinead O'Connor tore up the picture of the Pope on Saturday Night Live and she said, "Fight the real enemy." They figure out that the real enemy is something. So they fight that. And then they're like, "We're cool, bro. All right." And then they do their respective things. It was dumb. But it was nice to be in the cinema again. And then I saw a press screening last week at the Film Forum. I haven't been to Film Forum in 14 months, at least.
But good to be back.
Saw a press screening of La Piscine, the Jacques Deray film from 1969 that's been very nicely restored and is a very interesting picture that I'm reviewing in the New York Times. It'll be appearing on Thursday the 13th or Friday the 14th. Interestingly, today, the 11th, when we're recording this conversation, is indeed May the 11th, and that's the day in the film Goodfellas in which Henry finally gets arrested at the end of a paranoid day of snorting cocaine and making an elaborate meal.
Well, that's why I calendared it. I did it on purpose, you see.
There you go. I thought it was something of a coincidence.
I'd like to talk a little bit about how you got into writing about movies and then how you went from being a critic, well, which you still are, obviously, but how you decided to take the step and write books as well.
I was talking about this with my class the other day. I teach language of film at NYU. As a kid, I wasn't really well socialized. Let's just put it that way. There's certain respects in which I'm probably still not entirely well socialized. I'm 61 years old, and I still wear Famous Monsters t-shirts. So there's something wrong. So I went to the movies a lot. Movies were a form of escape. I wasn't interested in seeing myself in films. Of course, as a white guy, I could always take that privilege, such as it is, if I wanted to. But that wasn't my main interest in films. My main interest in films was just sort of getting out of the world that I was in, which led me to great enthusiasm for horror films. I was interested, although I didn't know it at the time because I was too young to know it, but I was interested in what the surrealists called the derangement of the senses. That's what I wanted out of movies. So I was very attuned to horror films. I remember very vividly being 10 years old and seeing Night of the Living Dead. That was kind of a formative experience. And I started reading film criticism relatively early on. I had two books that were very important to me. One was P.E. Salas Gomez's biography of Jean Vigo, which I bought when I was about 12 years old from the bookstore at the Museum of Modern Art, where my aunt would take me. My Brooklyn aunt would take me to MoMA and places like that in the hope of improving my sensibility, my curious sensibility. And I also stole from my good friend Alan Siegel. Alan Siegel had a copy of the book, Carlos Clarence's book, An Illustrated History of Horror and Sci-Fi Movies, which I borrowed from him and never gave back, which I feel bad about. But then a couple of years later, I gave a deposition when him and his parents tried to sue a bus that sideswiped him while we were both bicycling around Dumont, New Jersey. So I feel it was a fair enough exchange. I don't know. I've never asked him about it. I don't know what happened to him. I hope he's okay. Eventually, I bought my own copy of the book. I have a revised edition still in my library. So those were two big books for me. And I guess they gave me the intimation about how films could be written about. And then later in my teens, I read Sarris's book, The American Cinema, which is, was an important book, still is an important book. I mean, it's more discussed these days relative to its shortcomings than to its strengths, but, I still consider it of value. And that was the idea that, seemed like, when you're a teenager, you don't really formulate these things in terms of a life plan, but it looked fun. But I was more interested in music, and I read a lot more music criticism.
Did you start writing music criticism?
Oh, yeah, very, very much so. As I worked at my college paper in a desultory fashion, and I wrote film reviews, but I mostly wrote music reviews. I was very arrogant. I made a lot of mistakes, some of them very embarrassing. Only I am aware of them because most of my college newspaper's print run has been long pulped, which I find very happy news. I could tell you some tales, but they would still be embarrassing. But that's a great place to learn. It's a lot of writers today don't have that outlet for learning, how to do things properly and kind of making your embarrassing mistakes sort of outside of the realm of public scrutiny. So now they make them in the realm of public scrutiny, which is, an interesting career path.
And nothing ever goes away.
No, fortunately, though, my college papers material has well and truly gone away. I've been looking recently at my reviews for Premiere because there's someone I'm working with who's been scanning the old pages from the magazine and digitizing my old Premiere reviews for a project that may see public light of day at some point soon. And even those, I'd say there's about 60% of them that I'm completely mortified by, and 35. This is the condition of being a writer, I think, is that you're always looking at your own work and finding terror and despair. But I wrote mostly about music, and I started out professionally writing about music. I had a very fortunate experience of submitting a piece to a magazine on spec, and instead of having it rejected, which I was told would happen, and that I was told it would happen over and over again before I'd ever had a piece accepted, the first piece I submitted to a magazine was accepted by that magazine, partially because I'd actually crafted it according to what I saw were its departments that were open to new writing, which when I finally got a job as an editor in a magazine, I found a lot of freelance writers or would-be freelance writers just didn't do that at all. They just submitted stuff that had nothing to do with the magazine's subject matter or any of its departments, which I thought, well, this is why so many of them get rejected so often. I wrote a piece that the editor of this particular magazine could simply slot in the front of the book department without much fuss. And that I learned when I became an editor is is a great thing to get as an editor. So I was smart enough to intuit that, and my writing was okay. And then, and then that led me to the Village Voice, where I pitched Robert Christgau, who was the music editor at the time, and he didn't take my pitch right away, but we had a very spirited exchange, which led to him finally accepting the pitch. And I started writing for him, and he was great. He was a really important person in my professional life because he was the first real editor I ever had, and that he would go over the piece with me line by line and tell me what was working and what wasn't, and challenge the assertions I'd made. A lot of the lessons he gave me, I didn't really fully assimilate until much later on. But, that was a really valuable circumstance for a young writer. And it's something, again, that doesn't happen with for many young writers today. So what happened was I worked as a music critic, and it didn't, there wasn't a lot of money in it. I still had to work other jobs and so on and so forth. So I applied for a job in a magazine called Video Review in 1986. And it was because of my work at the Village Voice that I actually got the job, I later learned, which was, good to know. And I got the job did not involve writing music reviews. It was the magazine was about video hardware and software. It reviewed Laserdiscs and VHS cassettes, but it was mainly known for its reviews of hardware, VCRs, televisions, camcorders. And my job, the most important part of my job was to edit the test reports. All of this hardware was sent to a lab in Connecticut where it was tested by this crew of guys who wore white lab coats and, measured things like signal to noise ratio and foot candles of light that came from a television. I've forgotten more about CRT television technology than most people ever learn. And now, of course, CRT television technology is all but completely obsolete and irrelevant. So I have no idea. I could actually tell you something about a plasma television's technological makeup or a LED television's technological makeup, but I couldn't tell you all that much that's important, except that, televisions are now more like the engines of cars than they've ever been. That is to say, both a car engine and a television are essentially giant computers with different ends and purposes. But I also, while I was at Video Review, I got a chance to start writing about films on video. I was an early adopter of Criterion Collection when they were doing laser discs, and I would review things like the Taxi Driver laser disc. But in that process of evaluating the hardware or the characteristics of the disc, I could write about the film. Come full circle because I'm reviewing theatrical film releases off of Blu-ray discs. So writing about that for Video Review did get me more into film. I did some pieces, exploring that had kind of film music crossovers, like when David Lynch did the Industrial Symphony at Brooklyn Academy of Music, did a feature piece about that where I interviewed Lynch and Julie Cruz and Angela Badalamenti. A few years later, I guess in 1996, one of my colleagues from Video Review was put in charge of Premiere Magazine, and he hired me to come over there. And at first I was actually just doing odds and ends, including a tech supplement where I, explored the new format of DVD and that sort of thing.
It'll never go anywhere. That DVD,
no.
It'll never take on.
Well, actually, what did we write about? We wrote about the difficulties of video compression and how it wasn't quite there yet. When you had early DVDs, the basis of the DVD format was something called MPEG-4, which I saw demonstrated in Japan in the late 80s. And it looked terrible. It looked like early TiVo. We used to joke about how the recordings on TiVo were basically reduced the content to sock puppet theater. And by the time DVD came out in the mid-90s, they had certainly refined it to a large extent. But because the visual information had to be very severely compressed, you would see a lot of interesting anomalies. And those were especially prominent when you had direct lighting sources within the frame. So one of the earliest DVDs was of Friedkin's The Exorcist. And when you looked at, say, the subway scene, and there's the oncoming train, the headlights of the actual subway looked very weird. So, you would look at these discs with an eye to what worked and what didn't, and anytime there was an explosion or a fire and it looked kind of simulated, you knew that the video compression was not doing its job. Then I was asked to edit David Foster Wallace's piece about David Lynch. And that kind of got me hired on full time. And then a couple of years later, it was decided that I would be the film reviewer. It was a challenge because Premiere was a monthly magazine and we had a rather strict lead time. You had to finish the book. You had to have it ready for the printer like maybe 6 weeks before it would actually hit newsstands or be sent to subscribers. So the whole idea of film reviews was kind of fraught because of lead time. We didn't know if we'd get studio cooperation, if they'd show us films that far ahead of time. But they wanted the coverage. Premiere was actually a well thought of magazine. We had a kind of, if we build it, they will come sort of approach to the idea of doing anywhere from 3 to 9 reviews a month. And we also didn't want to ghettoize it and just do indie films, which are generally ready for viewing well before the blockbuster pictures were. But I think we had a pretty good run. People were very enthusiastic about getting reviewed in Premiere, and I was extremely feisty voice at the magazine. And I was an incredibly obnoxious person to work with. But that's that's for a different kind of podcast. And getting into books was, if you're a writer, you always have ambitions to write books. Sure. My dad was, when I did my first book, I edited a book called A Galaxy Not So Far Away, Writers and Artists on 25 Years of Star Wars, which came out in 2002, the only Star Wars book to not make money. So it has that exciting distinction. It was a collection of essays by people such as Jonathan Lethem, Tom Carson, Elvis Mitchell, Lydia Millett.
How could it not make money? How is that possible?
I'll get to that. Harry Allen, a lot of great people, Todd Hanson, the Onion writer, Neil Pollack, Joe Queenan, Erica Krauss, the novelist, Tom Bissell, a great writer who was really the co-editor of the book. These were essays considering Star Wars from the perspective of 25 years after its initial release. And this was well before, I think, Star Wars fandom became truly toxic, which I think it absolutely is now. And it was issued by Henry Holt, an imprint of Henry Holt called Owl Books. And I think one reason it didn't do well was because Holt at the time was very skittish about promoting the book. They were afraid that Lucasfilm would raise some objection to it, although there's only 2 essays out of almost, I don't know how many essays there were, but there were a lot. And out of all the essays, there were like maybe 2 or 3 that were kind of negative or looked at Star Wars askew. The rest of them were all like, we love Boba Fett, that sort of thing. Lydia Millett wrote about her inner Darth Vader. Erica Krauss wrote about seeing Star Wars, how it influenced her in terms of learning martial arts. All sorts of very interesting things. Harry Allen wrote about the hip-hop crossover with Star Wars. So it was an interesting book. And it just didn't get the right kind of push. Although a couple of years ago, Cass Sunstein, the American jurist and essayist, and wrote a Star Wars themed book about life lessons from Star Wars or something, in which he cited A Galaxy Not So Far Away several times. So it didn't get read by a whole lot of people, but it got read by the right people, I guess you could say. But, when that book came out, I was having a discussion with my dad, and he said, well, when are you going to do your own book? And I rolled my eyes, and I'm still rolling my eyes. But it's not, it's not a question of it just happens like that. Once, I started working with one agent and then with a second agent, and it's a lot of work. And it gets to a certain extent, it gets worse all the time. Although now for myself, because Made Men was well received and sold well, it's gotten better. But the whole thing about books is that no one, it's like Chris McQuarrie when he said, nobody wants to make your movie. Nobody wants to publish your book. There's a lot of work that goes into creating an idea. In 2015, my agent and I had been talking to a publisher, and there was this notion of doing a history of the transformation of Times Square. And for some reason, this was the idea was to do something that would be potentially like Devil in the White City. And I worked on a proposal for that for quite some time. And I came up with a proposal that went from 1975 or so to 1997, when The Lion King opened on Broadway, and the transformation and Disneyfication of Times Square was, at a kind of a definitive peak. And we did this proposal, and it was a lot of work, and it was turned down by the person who sort of semi-commissioned it because it was too grim. And this was a crime imprint that I was pitching it to. So that was weird. And then, we had all sorts of discussions with other publishers, and somebody said, well, another person said, well, there's not enough hookers getting killed in the book. And I'm like, what am I supposed to do? Get a time machine and go kill some hookers so I can sell my book? I don't know. Then there was the whole business about how Times Square's, a lot of the shutdown of Times Square had a profound impact on the trans community. And that was an interesting idea. But there was also this idea that as a cis white male, maybe I wasn't the person to tell the story of how the transformation of Times Square affected the trans community. So there's all sorts of things that are open to question. There's all sorts of reasons not to publish a book. One reason that Made Men didn't get picked up in 2016 or so, but there was another making of book. I had done Made Men. I had done a proposal for Made Men, and again, this was something you do for no money. In 2014, it made the rounds of publishers, and everybody said, "Oh, this book's going to be great. We wish Glenn the best of luck. We're not going to do it," because that year there had been another making of book that was that in winter of 2014, early winter of 2014, another making of book that was very highly anticipated and very largely bruited came out and was a complete sales flop. So at that point, making of books were just taboo. 4 years after the fact, my publisher, my agent said, I'm working with an editor now who's more open to this sort of thing. Why don't you dust off the proposal for the Goodfellas book, which at the time was called Everything Was for the Taking, a line of dialogue from the film and not deemed eventually the most catchy title for the marketing department. Why don't you dust that off and then see if we can get this editor interested? So I dusted it off, and we did get the editor interested briefly. And eventually he just felt that my approach was going to be too analytical and not narrative enough. He was very concerned about the oral history that had been published in GQ magazine recently. Like, how was I going to be different from GQ? My answer was sort of like, well, the GQ oral history is very good. And I did end up using it as a source for some stuff in the book. But, like so many oral histories, it has a tendency to go in the direction of the SNL sketch that Chris Farley used to do, the Chris Farley show, where, a real life celebrity would show up and Chris Farley would say, and even at one point, Martin Scorsese himself, remember that scene in Goodfellas where such and such happened? And Scorsese will go, yes. And go, that was great. There's a lot of that. So my feeling was, well, you have a critical voice, you have a critical analysis, and I will, and I was intending to get actual narrative material that wasn't in the GQ oral history. And I do believe I did, certainly relative to Barbara DeFina's story. So that was my response, but this was unsatisfactory to that editor. So that editor, who we had pinned our hopes on, turned it down. So that made me. But then we thought, well, we've got this pitch now. It's, dusted off. Let's show it around and see who might be interested. And that's how we found Hanover Square Press and their editor, Peter Joseph, who really, really let me write the book that I wanted to write. And the thing is, I'm an older man now. I do write freelance for the New York Times and for RogerEbert.com. There's a feeling, in the zeitgeist in America that white male critics of a certain age are reaching a point of obsolescence. So being able to write books, is having that in your wheelhouse, so to speak, is very welcome, as is teaching. I want to hang on to writing reviews on a regular basis for as long as I'm capable of doing it without embarrassing myself too much. But the times are changing. I don't feel at the moment I have a really valid retirement plan. So the thing about having done Made Men and having it done well is that I'm now working on a second book for the same publisher.
Can you tell us anything about it?
Yeah, I think I can. It's called, well, the title will probably change, so I won't say what the title is right now. But it's a book about the film Sleepless in Seattle, and a book about Nora Ephron, the film's director, and her story in Hollywood relative to her larger life story, although it's not a biography of Nora Ephron as such, which I sometimes have to keep reminding myself of when I'm doing interviews and taking notes. There are several reasons I wanted to do the book. Obviously, the most practical reason relative to the publisher's wishes is that 2023, when we hope to publish, will be the 30th anniversary of Sleepless in Seattle. We published.
That's a long time. I didn't realize it'd been around since.
It is a long time, as and we keyed the publication of Made Men, the story of Goodfellas, to the 30th anniversary of Goodfellas. This turned out to be a good idea. But I also like the idea because it's sort of considered relative to my own work. It could be conceived as counterintuitive, because I've written a book about Goodfellas. I've also written a book about Robert De Niro. So every now and then, if somebody wants to be snippy with me on Twitter, they'll say that I'm a Scorsese De Niro fanboy. I think this will show another facet of my critical thinking to a certain extent. But it's also not entirely unrelated to Goodfellas, because Nora Ephron, the director of Sleepless in Seattle and also contributor to the script, was married to Nick Pileggi, the author of Wise Guy, the film upon which Goodfellas was based, and she wrote 2 scripts that are directly influenced by her personal interactions with Henry Hill and other mob figures, those being Cookie, directed by Susan Seidelman, and starring Peter Falk as a mobster who complains that he won't be able to good eggplant if he goes to prison, and then My Blue Heaven, directed by Herbert Ross, in which Steve Martin plays a gangster in the witness protection program who at one point complains while living in California that he can't find arugula in the local supermarket. So there's a lot of, that's the 2 iterations of the joke that would wind up being one of the penultimate lines of narration in Goodfellas. The other night I ordered spaghetti with marinara sauce and I got egg noodles with ketchup. So there's that. Obviously the Sleepless in Seattle is not Cookie or My Blue Heaven, but one source that I've been working with has stated that one reason Nora Ephron was so keen on becoming a director was because she felt that Herbert Ross, the director of My Blue Heaven, had made such a hash of her material that she might as well get in and start doing her own material. Although interestingly enough, not a lot of the films that she did direct originated as her own projects. There were only a couple of those that did. So we'll be looking at, there's also the fact that she was born in New York. Her parents moved to Beverly Hills when she was 5 and became very successful screenwriters. She couldn't wait to get out of Beverly Hills. She wanted to go to New York and be Dorothy Parker. That's putting it simplistically, but she did go to New York. She developed an exceptionally singular voice as an essayist and journalist, and then went back to Hollywood to make these movies, some of which were substantial blockbuster hits. So how does one do that? How does one wrap one's head around that, making those steps? So, and Sleepless in Seattle was, her second film as a director and a humongoid hit. So, there's that too. There's also Sleepless in Seattle's lineage relative to the rest of American romantic film or romantic comedy. The fact that it is so much tied in with An Affair to Remember and the original version, Love Affair from 1939 with Irene Dunne and Charles Boyer. It's also got other tendrils stretching back to the American romantic comedy. Bill Pullman's character is very much in sort of a more modern, updated mode of the Ralph Bellamy character in The Awful Truth or His Girl Friday. So its connections to American romantic comedy and the way it deviates from American romantic comedy in certain crucial respects are all very interesting to me.
How do you sort of decide on, because you have to devote a significant part of your life to one film if you're going to do a making of book like Maids Men and Sleepers in Seattle. How does the film find you, or do you consciously go through a list of films you want to do, or is it just a mixture of that and commercial, what the publisher wants?
The first film book I wanted to do, and this was something I've worked on with the agent I had before, the one I have today, but we wanted to, and it was definitely the suggestion of the agent, was a Scarface book, a Brian De Palma Scarface. We tried several configurations for a proposal for that, and it didn't sell for reasons that I'm not quite sure, but it probably would have been a nightmare if it had sold, because I think that I admire Brian De Palma as a director very much, but I feel like he would have been a difficult person to deal with relative to a project like this.
I interviewed him very early on in my own journalistic career, and it was for a film that he was showing at Venice. It was one of I can't remember the name of the film, with Noomi Rapace.
Oh, Passion.
Yeah. And I said, "Oh, is it great for you to release this movie in Venice, the home of the Giallo? Dario Argento and the Giallo and everything." And he said, "Oh, I've never seen a Giallo. I don't know what they are." I'm sure that's not true. I'm sure you're aware of what they are. At the very least, it just felt like there was a sort of moment of sort of challenge of sort of, are you going to call me on this, or are you?
Yeah, he doesn't like being. I think he doesn't like being led. Is one interesting quirk. But yeah, so the idea of doing a making of book has always kind of within the scope of what kind of film books are actually marketable today. And making of books, despite that one hiccup in 2014, actually are becoming increasingly marketable. It seems. Glenn Frankel's book on Midnight Cowboy is being very well received. There's Sam Wasson's book on Chinatown and Polanski and all that. So I mean, we're in a good position market with respect to the market to do making of books. So Sleepless in Seattle the idea came about when I was discussing it with my editor at Hanover Square Press. Having done this book with me, they wanted to do another book with me. It was decided we probably shouldn't pivot away from film immediately. Not that it's not like I'm super eager to pivot away from film, but there's other things I'd like to write about. I wrote a novel while in quarantine that I'm actually also trying to sell, which would be nice if it sold. So, we just sort of started, bouncing ideas back and forth. And once Sleepless in Seattle came up, I thought, well, of course, not so much of course, but this is valid. This will work. But also, my approach, it's a film I like, obviously, and it's a film I admire. It's not necessarily a film that I have the same relation to as Goodfellas, as outlined in the book Made Men. I met Scorsese as a journalist while he was editing Goodfellas, and I had been in my 20s a Scorsese fanboy. That's a different kind of relationship. But my critical relation, I feel very comfortable with the fact of watching Sleepless in Seattle a bunch of times over the next year.
Yeah, I think it's good for everyone critically to sort of approach different genres. One thing I noticed when I was reading Made Men is that it's such a fun book, the way you put so much into it. There's the music, there's the food, you even have a recipe in there. And I saw on your Twitter feed earlier you were sort of posted a shot of the recipe. So have you've also made this food? I really like that sort of sense of interaction with the movie, that you're watching it and you're talking to people and making it, but you're also sort of there's a real sense of interaction with the film. Was that a way of important for you to sort of make the book different, give it buzz?
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those things where I was going to use my own relationship to the movie throughout. It had been decided that my meeting with Scorsese in 1989 would open the book, so it would have a kind of a personal perspective. But then again, it's one of those things where I guess people have told me this, and I'm aware of it to a certain extent, but one of the things that I like to do as a critic is make connections. In my mind, I do have a lot of places where my mind and my knowledge can go, where I can draw connections to things. So, when I talk about the music in the film, I'm not just going to talk about X, Y, and, this song is here, this song is there. I'm going to talk about what doo-wop music actually is and what doo-wop music actually means. And what's the meaning of doo-wop music to someone like Scorsese? It's a black form that was, embraced by whites and adopted by whites, and to a certain extent corrupted by whites in the same way that late, R&B turned into rock and roll and was kind of pasteurized, to say the least, by Pat Boone. And so I'm going to talk about that because it does have meaning in terms of how the music is used in the film. Even Scorsese talks about at the end of the film, when things are going bad for the Goodfellas, that the doo-wop that's used in those scenes is entering its decadent phase. How do you know what he means by that? I mean, you can just accept it at face value, but it's fun for me to kind of walk the reader through just what he means by that. So, that's going to happen. I'm going to talk about Layla. I'm not going to talk about just Layla being, this signpost of dad rock. I'm going to talk about Jim Gordon, the guy who composed the piano coda and his own schizophrenia and the fact that he's in jail for murdering his mother. These are things that are, to me, they don't have a direct relation to the film, but these circumstances have a resonance that is noteworthy. And because that's also where my mind goes. I've always been curious. A lot of people will say, well, don't use words of several syllables. Don't make your reader look up words. Don't do that. That's just, pretentious and affected. But I was never one of those readers. I would read things and I'd look up the words. And when I was reading Cream magazine in the 70s, if they mentioned Gavin Bryar's The Sinking of the Titanic in a sarcastic endnote to a letter to the editor, I'd find out what Sinking of the Titanic was. That was just what I did. I want to bring that to what I write. And Goodfellas has a lot of references and a lot of allusions and things in there that are, once you dig deeper, are very interesting to get into. Not just Sunshine of Your Love being dismissed by Jerry Wexler as psychedelic hogwash, but also things in the real life of Henry Hill and his relation to Edward McDonald, his relation to the FBI agents who were investigating other cases that he was giving information about. All that stuff to me is like, okay, this is fascinating. And it has something to do with the film. So why not go there? It's not, to me, it's not filler. It's not trivia. It's real stuff.
Do you ever get like one of those investigators for a serial killer who has the wall with red thread connecting everything from here? Is that have you got one of those spider maps in your mind?
I watched the film an awful lot, and I made a lot of notes. And the interesting thing to me was, especially during the writing of the fourth chapter, which is a scene-by-scene breakdown of the movie, kind of alternating my own observations of what's going on screen with the material I collected in interviews, and talking about the Bamboo Lounge and the actual shooting location for the interior being the Hawaii Kai restaurant, and whether or not the Hawaii Kai was, everybody's memory of this varies. Some people remember, oh my God, yes, there were fleas. Other people are like, no, there weren't fleas. I would have gotten bitten. But, I have to include both. So alternating that with the description of how the Steadicam shot was achieved, all those things. Yeah, obviously, a lot of it is in the notes, but then you find it in the writing. You'll find, as you're writing something down, an ideal place to say, oh, okay, and here's where I can talk about the fleas or something.
When you met Scorsese, you had no sort of inkling that you were going to write this book, or
1989? No way.
No. I mean, the film hadn't even come out at that point, obviously, because he was just making it. But
it was very convenient when I started doing the book, for sure. But I'm sorry, I cut off your question. It sounds like.
I mean, you mentioned earlier that you're a big fanboy, to use a big admirer of Scorsese. We actually need a sort of a noun for people who like Scorsese. We're not going to get one today, I guess. But what drew you to Scorsese as a filmmaker, and is he your sort of, is he up there at the top of your pantheon?
Oh, sure. I mean, he's not the only filmmaker I revere. Where do you want me to start? Mizoguchi, Wells, Claire Denis. There's plenty in my pantheon. He's definitely in them, and he certainly was influential early on. A lot of the stuff that you get as a critic, it's all contingent on what you're able to see. And as a teenager and as a kid growing up, I didn't get into New York. I only started going into New York when I was like 12 or 13, and at that point, I was mainly interested in Buñuel, so I saw things like The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. So Buñuel, he's a big one. Scorsese's films played close to where I lived. And also, I'm partially Italian-American. I was raised in Fort Lee, New Jersey. So when you're 13 or 14 and you see something like Mean Streets and the opening with Be My Baby and the home movies, and you're like, oh, okay, wait, I know these people. These are relatives of mine. So that hooked you in for sure. I don't have relatives in the mafia that I know of. There are, at certain funerals years ago, I've been told, oh yeah, that one. They're not people I was ever very close with. I don't consider it romantic to have relatives who are criminals, but I've been a criminal. It's not romantic. But
Wait. Back up.
I've done criminal things.
Okay.
Not in an organized crime sense, but
in a disorganized crime sense.
Yeah, very disorganized. I have a disorderly conduct in my jacket. So, but I understood that world. When I saw Raging Bull with my mother, she understood that world very, very closely. That helps, I think, talking about seeing yourself on the screen. I never saw myself on the screen in a Scorsese film, for sure. I'd hope not. But I saw people that I perceived as real people, or more real than the people I'd usually been seeing in films. But also, I like the dynamism of the filmmaking. I like the music. The performances were extremely vivid, obviously. So, I mean, there's a lot in, Scorsese is not to everyone's taste, but you can't say that he does not make distinctive films, and that they don't have a very particular point of view. And that point of view was different than a lot of the stuff that you'd see in Hollywood's films. When you think about the people that he came up with in Hollywood during the Easy Riders Raging Bull, what is called the Easy Riders Raging Bulls era, he has in a sense, the most particular style. Spielberg has a particular style that is harder to pin down than Scorsese's. But with Scorsese, you have certain aspects of like the use of slow motion in a shot and things like that. Spielberg has a lot of stuff that's a signal idea of his style, but the most prominent thing is something that's kind of hard to pin down, but that Hitchcock really pinned down when he talked about Spielberg getting rid of the proscenium. But Coppola, you have to work pretty hard to nail down his style, and it does change. There are shifts in it from film to film. Bogdanovich, very classical style. Scorsese is someone who you can kind of, who like Hitchcock, who like Wells. You can kind of look at his films and say, oh, okay, Scorsese. And even people who imitate Scorsese don't do it well enough to the extent that you'd mistake them for a Scorsese film. So that's certainly significant, I'd say.
Yeah, I was just thinking about people who imitate Scorsese. I suppose what was the name of the film with Bradley Cooper and Christian Bale?
Disaster. American Jungle, American Folly,
American Hustle.
Hustle, yes.
Which, I mean, to tell you the truth, that's one of my bête noirs, is the use of American in the title. It just sort of like seems such a lazy... There have been good movies with American in the title, but you're already 5 points down on my personal scorecard. How did you find? You just said you wrote a novel during the lockdown. How did you find that process? I mean, obviously extremely different from writing a book about film, but it's also still sitting there, banging out the words.
Yeah, it was weird. Well, I mean, this is the third novel I've written, and hopefully this one will get published. The first novel I wrote was rejected in a very unusual way by most of the people who rejected it. It was one of those things that just sort of, there was a precipitating incident in my actual life during the COVID semi-quarantine that kind of kicked off this. Yeah. So the first novel I wrote was rejected in a very kind way by many people who very liked it very much. It was a thriller. They liked it very much, and they all said that they'd be killed if they published it, which is a weird way of being rejected. And things have only gotten worse for that novel. So we may be a long way from seeing that one get published. And the second one, different reaction, certain things. But this one just sort of, I think as Paul Schrader put it about his writing Taxi Driver, he said the movie sprung out of my mind like an animal. And that was kind of what happened with this novel, which is a relatively short novel, about the length of The Great Gatsby. It's about 50,000 words. There was a precipitating incident, and all of a sudden I thought, aha. And it was one of those things, I don't want to get into it too specifically because I feel like it could be published and it could be commercial. There were points during which I was writing it that I thought, oh my God, which is actually always a really good feeling. If you're afraid of what you're writing, you may be onto something, or you may be onto being unpublishable. But it was one of those things where, obviously the whole thing didn't download into my brain, but I saw the beginning and I saw the ending, and as I began writing it, I saw the ways that I could make the structural connections that would make it an actual story. The story is interesting because it's kind of the same structure as Clockwork Orange, specifically Kubrick's adaptation of Clockwork Orange, that there's specific incidents that happen to Alex among specific people. Then he's put in prison and given the Ludovico treatment. And then the cycle starts again, and he has specific incidents with the same specific people in this different context. And that's essentially the structure of the novel relative to the protagonist's childhood and adulthood. So that was fun. It was also daunting and weird and scary. And eventually I'm still waiting for my agent to read it. He's a very busy man. But I'm hoping once he does, we'll get on the track to showing it to some editors, including obviously my current editor, who has right of first refusal. There's some things you sort of like plot out and then you kind of labor at them and you solve problems before doing the actual writing. And in this case, it was just one of those things where it was like, I just knew what it was going to be. And I knew it was going to be relatively short within that neighborhood of writing. I won't say it was easy, but it was something that, I was able to do in a relatively fast amount of time. And I was able to find the proper style relatively quickly, too. I wish all projects were like that.
Having the lockdown, was that a sort of advantage as well, in the sense that there weren't any screenings? And
yeah, no, I was sitting around the house a lot. Still sitting around the house a lot.
Best ally of the writer, sitting around the house a lot with nothing else to do.
That's for sure.
So, what I wanted to ask you as well, Glenn, is do you have a recommendation for a film book that other people who may not have encountered and that influenced you, or is just important to you?
I think anything by Robin Wood, but one book that I really felt strongly about during the writing of Made Men was Robin Wood's book about Howard Hawks, kind of a landmark study of Hawks. And I thought, well, if I can make my book as good as this or somewhere near as good as this, I'll be happy. So that was a book I thought a lot about, even though the structure and the approach Robin Wood's Hawks book is very different from my book. And another book that's about a single film and also has a completely different approach from my book is Raymond Durgnat's A Long Hard Look at Psycho. So the two British film critics who I admire very much. Yeah. And everybody should read Molly Haskell. But yeah, in terms of being related and not related to my own work, that the Wood and Durgnat are very important.
It's important as well to have stuff that has a little distance to you because, or to at least I find in my own writing, I love people who write stuff that I think, I love that. I'm never going to approach, not in terms of quality, but I'm just not writing that kind of stuff. But I love to see someone else do it.
Yeah, these are the things that inspire me. So
what about like you said you started at the very beginning. You said you started getting into movies with like horror, science fiction. Did you ever like to sort of go back and have a look at that for a book?
No, not at the moment. I think, I look at the work of my friend who I've never met, Tim Lucas, and I think that guy's got it all sewn up. And Stephen Thrower, another British writer, his work on Jess Franco and Lucio Fulci and other is I think fantastic and interesting. And it certainly influenced me to a certain extent because it's shown me new ways of thinking about cinema that most critics condemn as trash. That's important to me, I think. So yeah, but I don't necessarily know that I would. Certainly it'd be interesting to write about George Romero. It'd be more interesting to write about him while he was still alive. Unfortunately, I'm sorry he passed. But yeah.
How do you feel about the modern sort of horror?
Not very good. It's one of those things where I don't want to seem like a nostalgist, but I think I can't relate to things like the Saw movies. I think they're just completely kind of self-conscious trash exercises in scab picking. I actually like Eli Roth's movies better than those. I have an old friend who I grew up with, who I watched all these movies with, Night of the Living Dead and so on and so forth. And for a long time, he worked at a video store. People would check out these latter-day horror movies and they'd ask him what he thinks, and he's like, what is the matter with you? You don't like horror movies? He said, I do like horror movies. I just don't like the way they make them now. Actually, there are some that are good. There are The Deeper You Dig, I think, is an excellent contemporary horror movie made by the Addams family. Not the Charles Addams family, but another family of regional filmmakers named Addams without the second D. That's an excellent contemporary horror movie. And I just got a DVD of A Ghost Walks, and I hear that's very good, and I'm going to check that out. And I'm not too crazy about the more self-conscious stuff, the fake giallo, but I do very much like, what's his name? Peter, the guy who did Fabric. I think Fabric is really good. And, I like Ari Aster with some reservations. Peter Strickland, excuse me.
Peter Strickland.
That guy's fabulous. I don't know what Ben Wheatley's up to now, but he did some effective work. But Strickland
He's got one coming out.
Strickland is great. Ari Aster is really talented, but a lot of the stuff is just more self-consciousness than I can stand. I did not care for that Farm Film Report thing with Spielberg's son.
I don't know if I've seen that one.
No, it was out in the States a bit. Honeydew. Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, didn't like that at all. So I'll say it's mixed, but it's not a complete wash, but the mainstream of what's going on in contemporary horror is not something I'm that enthusiastic about.
Certain genres always strike me that they're not really the genres they tend to be, or at least many of the more mainstream movies don't tend to inhabit those genres. So it's like a lot of comedies strike me as action movies with jokes, and a lot of action movies strike me with comedies with action sequence. And sometimes the horror movies that you mentioned, like Saw, they feel more like comedies just with gross out moments than actual horror movies. And I think horror's in a very strange place at the moment.
The thing about the Saw movies is that they don't really take the central. They set up this gambit that's just incredibly sadistic, and they act as if they're taking the existential conundrums of that gambit seriously, but they're really not. Oh, could you saw off your own hand? It's like, yeah, you might pass out of you might just pass out from shock before you've actually got the saw halfway across some area of your body. What about that? It sounds idiotic to like fault these pictures on a lack of realism, but it's emblematic of the extent to which they're actually taking what they're selling seriously, which is not very. They had this nifty, disgusting, nasty, anti-human idea, and we're going to run with that.
Yeah, does it help having body horror if you don't have a realistic concept of what the body is?
That's another way of looking at it, for sure.
Well, listen, Glenn, thanks very much for giving us your time, and I encourage everyone to read Made Men: The Story of Goodfellas, which is doing very well. But if you haven't had an opportunity to read it, get yourself a copy.
Yeah, it could always do better.
It can always do better. Absolutely. Let's not get everything is there for the taking, Glenn. Everything is there for the taking.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, John. Anytime.
Okay, that was our conversation with me and Glenn. I hope you enjoyed it. His book, just say one final time, Made Men: The Story of Goodfellas. So it's well worth a read if you haven't already read it. And I should be back with another episode next week. Please like, subscribe. But until then, take care.